Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. I'm Mandy Saven, I'm a content director at Stylus, a trends forecasting and intelligence business. My specialisms are in food and beverage, health and well-being, and consumer attitudes. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with my very chatty, brilliant, educated panel who are going to introduce themselves. So I'll hand you over to Anna.
Hi, I'm Dr. Anna Colton, clinical psychologist, and I specialise in eating disorders, particularly anorexia, and I'm really trying to shift the narrative so that we can prevent rather than just firefight and treat.
Simon?
I'm Dr. Simon Cork. I'm a neuroscientist who specialises in appetite regulation and how our bodies regulate hunger and body weight.
So, before we get stuck into this very juicy topic, which I'm sure everyone in this room already has an opinion about, I thought it would be really interesting to take a measure, sort of temperature check, of where the room sits right now. So, Ozempic Friends, Society Saviour or Saboteur? Please can I have a show of hands for Saviour? It's a really good showing. Can I have a show of hands for Saboteur? Slightly more for Saviour, would you agree?
It's about 50-50.
There's a lot of abstainers.
Yeah, some abstainers. So it's going to be really interesting to see if we can shift the dial on that by the time we're finished with our conversation today. So let's see what we can do. So I'd like to start with the science, and that brings me to you, Simon. So in my work at Stylus, we're consistently looking at research and data around health and well-being. We obviously try and be as rigorous and robust as possible. But the interesting thing about this topic is that the data often feels complicated, contradictory, really complex, and it's difficult to get the full picture. On one hand, we're getting really positive data through that weight loss drugs are helping with everything from heart health to alcohol addiction management, and they can even give you a longer life, says the latest study that's come out. But then on the other hand, really scary stuff about people losing their sight and the risk of thyroid tumors. So Simon, I ask you, what's true, what's not, what should we believe?
So I think it's important to start that question by understanding what the risks of obesity are in the first place. So we know that for patients who have obesity, and we're talking about those with really high body weights for whom these drugs are designed, they're significantly increased risk of up to 13 different types of cancer. There are significant risks around cardiovascular health, so increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, and metabolic diseases as well, like diabetes. So anything that we do that effectively lowers body weight reduces those risk factors. So a lot of the effects of these drugs are not direct on things like metabolic health, for example, or on cancer risk, but by lowering body weight, we significantly and massively reduce the risk of all of those disease states. So that's the first thing that is key, that by lowering body weight, we're reducing disease risk. There are some interesting results coming out about other conditions that seem to be benefited in this. So Alzheimer's disease, there's a link between obesity, metabolic disease, and Alzheimer's disease as well. But there's some long-term studies that show patients who are on these drugs have a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia long-term. But also cardiovascular disease, so things like heart attacks and strokes, the decreased risk of developing those conditions seems to be independent of weight loss, which is interesting, suggesting that there's a direct effect. So I think overwhelmingly these drugs are safe, and the health benefits associated both with weight loss, significant weight loss and sustained weight loss, is huge. But also there seems to be some other indirect effects as well, beneficial effects. There are so we know that the most common side effect that patients have on these drugs are around gastrointestinal, so things like nausea and diarrhea. Those tend to be transient, so patients tend to, if they're prescribed through a doctor, they slowly increase the dose, which reduces those side effects. and we know that, but for some people, those can be quite significant. Things like blindness, so there was a study last year that came out. It was an observational study that suggested there might be a slight increased risk of a very rare type of eyesight loss. That's not been directly proven yet, so I think we need to do more research into that. And things like pancreatitis, gallstones, those sorts of things are rare side effects, but highlight the importance of making sure that people who are on these drugs are under proper supervision by a medical practitioner.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, the benefits far outweigh the risks at
absolutely.
this point, and we should probably not buy into
certainly
the hype.
for those who for whom these drugs are prescribed, so those with significant obesity. If we take all of the health risks associated with obesity, then reducing those risks is a significant health benefit that is far outweighs any low-rate risk that these drugs pose.
And can you give this reassurance for a certain period of time? Like how far back does the data go?
So we've got patients who have been on, I think it's important to say that patients have been on lower doses of these drugs for a long time, for about 10 to 15 years to treat diabetes. What's happened more recently is that, so Ozempic, for example, is the drug that everyone talks about. Now, Ozempic and Wegovy are exactly the same drug. They're exactly the same thing under the hood, but they're at different doses. So we've got very long-term data to show the safety of low dose of these drugs, like Ozempic, because people have been on them to treat diabetes for a long time. We don't have as long-term data for the high dose of these drugs that we would see in patients who are being treated for obesity, but we certainly have sort of 5 to 6 years worth of data suggesting that they are safe over that time period. But what we don't have is the 10 to 15, 20 year safety data.
Okay, and that will come. So staying with the risk factors, we've looked at physical risk factor. I'd like to go to Anna for the more mental health piece. What sort of psychological red flags are you seeing around this whole movement? And do you think we'll be seeing more eating disorders and disordered eating?
So, there are a number of psychological red flags. I think the first of which is that these jabs are seen as a cure-all rather than a tool in a toolbox of interventions to manage obesity and overweight. So people think this is great. I'll get Ozempic, I'll get Wegovy, I'll lose the weight, I'll feel fantastic. And maybe that's true, but some people just can't tolerate them. Some people develop all sorts of side effects. Some people have many emotional reasons that contribute to the way they eat and their relationship with food. It's not addressed at all. So if there's a relationship with food issue, if there is eating disorder or disordered eating involved, they're just not addressed. And emotional eating is a coping strategy to tolerate distress. Eating disorders, they become a coping strategy. They are at the most fundamental level a coping strategy for managing unmanageable distress. An injection will not address that in any way. All it does, if I understand it right, and Simon, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is switch off an appetite receptor so the appetite disappears or is downregulated and becomes less strong. So hunger is reduced. Now, if you're emotional eating, or if you're eating for an emotional reason, then no, your appetite is irrelevant to that. No amount of food will fill an emotional void. And so if the reason that you're struggling with your weight, if the reason that you're overeating is emotional, the weight loss jab is not going to help. Now, if it does turn off your appetite and you really don't want to eat, you're going to be left with unmanageable distress. And you're going to have to find another method for dealing with it. So those are quite significant risks. Then what also happens is, of course, when people come off the medication, appetite returns, but there's been no adjustment to lifestyle. There's been no psychological work on understanding what has led or contributed to the overweight. And so the appetite comes back and the eating comes back. And finally for this, I think, it does feed in to all of the diet culture narrative that thin is desirable, thin is morally worthy, and fat and weight and bigger bodies are immoral and make you unworthy. And it just further entrenches that narrative, and particularly in our teens and our younger generation, and that is really risky.
If I can just the psychological aspect, I think it is really important. One of the big pushes at the minute, certainly from the government, is to try and get these rolled out as quickly as possible to as many people as possible. And there's a big push to get them. So at the minute, you can only really be prescribed these drugs from a doctor if you are in a what they call a tier 3 weight management service. It's a specialist hospital service that treats patients with obesity. Those are really rare. They're quite scattered across the country, and the waiting lists are really long. There's a big push now to get these prescribed out of GPs. Now, the risk with that is if you're in a tier 3 weight management service, you get psychological counseling, you get dietitian advice, you get physiotherapy advice. If you're getting these from a GP, you lose all of that wraparound care, and you run the risk of the psychological impacts that you've spoken about. So there is a nuance to how many people can get access to this drug within the current health system that we have.
Yeah, and a lot of that is kind of part of the kind of worrying piece, the people that aren't getting the proper holistic picture. But I want to sort of bring it a little bit further out. Looking at sort of social culture, and Anna, you already mentioned diet culture. I mean, are these drugs just a way of erasing anything other than thinness in society? And if this is the case, have we taken a giant leap backwards in terms of body positivity?
In short, I think we have taken a massive retrograde step. Not only in terms of body positivity, which is, I find, a slightly tricky concept, because you can't only be positive about your body. Everybody, irrespective of their weight, shape, size, will wake up some mornings and just feel uncomfortable in their body, uncomfortable in the clothes, look in the mirror and go, oh my God, I look bloody awful today, I can't bear it. So it's about body acceptance. Can we just accept the body we're in, think about its functions, think about the fact that it is the only place that we have to live. So we need to treat it well, respect it, and understand all the amazing things it enables us to do, rather than just focusing on the aesthetic. And so, yes, I think we have taken a big step backwards away from that. The other thing is that body positivity and body acceptance are usually societally thought about just for people in larger bodies. But actually, we all need to understand and accept our bodies, irrespective of our weight. And if Ozempic and the other GLP-1 medications were really strictly regulated and available only through bariatric weight management services, I think the conversation would be different. I think the issue we have is with regulation, which is it is just too easy to go to an online clinic, an Asda pharmacy, lie about your weight, and get them, and they will work in terms of inhibiting appetite, irrespective of your starting weight.
But the interesting thing here, and Simon, maybe you can debunk this myth, can everybody be thin biologically, if they go on these weight loss drugs, or are there going to be limitations depending on your body?
So the answer is that these drugs won't work for everyone.
They won't.
There's about, it depends on the study, but there's about 10 to 20% of people who don't respond to them. Obesity itself, body weight, how body weight is regulated is insanely complex, and we're only really just starting to understand and be able to unpick the biological complexity of it. We know that there are significant genetic factors that influence body weight and that influence both spectrums of the body weight, right? So overweight and underweight and everything in between. So for people who have a biological propensity to becoming obese, they are more likely to become obese, certainly within the obesogenic environment that we live. And if the underlying problem is not what this drug is targeting, then for them it won't work as well. For the vast majority of people, we know that those genetic differences that influence body weight, that predispose someone to becoming obese, lay within the appetite regulation centers of the brain, the areas of the brain that make you feel full, or that make you feel hungry, or that determine how much food you need to be able to feel full. This drug impacts that area of the brain and regulates that area of the brain. So for a lot of people, it will work to different extents. So some people might lose a larger amounts of weight than others. And I think what's important to understand is that these drugs in itself doesn't burn weight. It's not a jab or a drug that's burning excess fat. It requires you to modify lifestyle changes, and the extent to which you modify diet and exercise will influence how much weight you lose when you're on it.
So, I mean, is it true that you're only going to ever lose a percentage of your body weight? So you'll only ever lose 10 to 15%, and then that's it. So the fallacy of society becoming thin is just that.
No, so these drugs are, so Wegovy, which is the one that's kind of got a lot of media attention, the effectiveness of that drug, the studies show it's on average 16%, and that people will lose slightly less, and people may lose slightly more. But if you look at the drugs that are coming down the line, that are coming down phase trials, they can lose, they're showing much greater proportions of weight loss. So I think the more effective the drugs get, the more we understand how body weight is regulated, those drugs are going to get more effective, and people will be able to lose weight to a greater extent if putting a percentage on it is what we're looking for as an end goal in this treatment.
Okay.
But the drugs, they don't change your set weight point, do they?
No, so that's something we can explore.
So I want to explore that, but I also want to kind of go down the path of why society is so judgmental in the first place of our weight. It feels like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And even many people who are on these drugs are really reluctant to say so. They'll kind of admit it in hushed tones. And there's a lot of body shaming going on. Oh, she should be on. He should be on. He's thin enough now. He should really stop. And we're into the cycle of judging everybody. Anna, why is there so much body shaming and shame involved in taking these drugs?
So I think this is linked with the diet culture narrative, and my view is that actually diet culture is the predominant culture in which we live. And diet culture values thinness above all else. It views thinness as being morally good, as being better, as being a personal responsibility, as there being choice. And therefore, if you are slim, particularly if you're bigger and you lose weight through diet and exercise, that is viewed as having self-discipline, willpower, self-control, taking responsibility, being an act of self-care, and it's lauded and it's valued. If you use a weight loss medication to lose weight, it's viewed as, yeah, well, great, you've kind of done the thing that we like, which is shrink your body, but actually you've cheated. And so it's still morally reprehensible. You still don't have self-control. It's not really self-care. You haven't got any willpower, and you're denograted. I think we see it a little less interestingly with bariatric surgery, maybe because the surgery is so radical and because you cannot get it easily unless you really do go through the medical route and unless you meet criteria. So I think bariatric surgery, there is less stigma. But the weight loss jabs feed right in to the narratives about morally, thinness being morally good, willpower being morally good, self-care being all about what you put into your body and how much you exercise. And it ignores all of the conversations around privilege. It ignores all of the conversations around the biological impetus and the brain and how individual people's bodies and genetics work, and it just looks at your weight, shape, size, and your behaviours, and then judges for it, irrespective. So we are damned if we do, and we are damned if we don't, and that's what we've seen actually in the last year or so come out of Hollywood. Judgments on the red carpet, pre and post.
So, I mean, if you're someone who has lost the weight and you're determined to keep it off, and this is what you're committed to your new shape forever. In terms of turning to the medicine and the science, does this mean you're stuck with Ozempic or Mounjaro or Zepbound, whatever your drug of choice is, forever? And how can that be an acceptable outcome?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, it's important to understand how body weight is regulated. So the way I kind of teach this to my medical students is body weight is a little bit like the central heating in your house. So you set the central heating to 20 degrees, and if the temperature in your house drops below that, the heating comes on, the heating turns the temperature in your house up, and it keeps it, regulates it at the temperature that you've set. Body weight is really quite similar. So everybody has a largely genetically set body weight, which your body will try to protect. So I weigh about 76 kilos. I've weighed 76 kilos this time last year, probably weigh the same next year, and I don't have to do anything really to regulate that body weight. It's my stable weight.
You're very lucky.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So, but if I was to lose weight, and someone who is obese, someone who's overweight may have their set weight, the weight that their body protects may be higher. But the mechanism is the same for us all. If we try to lose weight, if we go on a diet, or if we restrict our calories and our body weight comes down, then a physiological mechanism kicks in to bring it back up. You feel hungry. So anyone who's dieted, or anyone who's fasted, or anyone, even if you've had the flu and you've been off the food for a few days, you feel hungry constantly. Hunger is a hugely powerful motivator of behavior. So you become hungry. All you think about is food. You become lethargic, tired, unmotivated to move. Your basal metabolism rate lowers. And all of those are physiological pressures to bring your body weight back to where you want it to go. And if you're dieting and exercising, and if you're trying to lose weight through the standard, everything that's being offered before, then the studies show that you would lose probably on average about 5% body weight. Now, if you are, let's say, 150 kilos and you lose 5% body weight, you now weigh 145 kilos. You're not going to see the difference in the mirror, right? You're not going to see. You feel crap because you feel hungry, you feel tired. You're grumpy, so your partner hates you. So you're just generally not a nice person, and you don't look any different in the mirror. You're not going to sustain that. So what these drugs do is they essentially switch the heating off.
Yeah.
They stop you from feeling hungry. They stop you from feeling lethargic, so that it's easier to lose weight through diet and exercise, because that physiological mechanism that kicks in that tries to bring your weight back up is switched off. So it makes it easier to lose weight. Now, the problem with that is that when you come off the drug, your brain suddenly realizes that your body weight is lower. We call that a starvation response. And the hunger kicks in, the lethargy kicks in, the grumpiness kicks in, and you put the weight back on.
Would you need to microdose forever to keep coming back to that?
I think what's been shown is that people who are on the effective dose, so whatever the effective dose is for them, usually it's quite a high dose. The longest data we have is about 5 years, and they show a plateauing. So the weight comes down after about a year and a half, 2 years, and it plateaus. But that plateauing sustains for the duration of the time that they're on this drug. Once they come off the drug, again, your brain wakes up and realizes that you've lost all this weight, and your body weight is below the set point, and it puts it back up again. I always liken these drugs to blood pressure drugs. So blood pressure is regulated in a similar way. Your blood pressure is regulated around a set point. Your set point will be different, but your blood pressure is automatically regulated. We give people who have got high blood pressure a tablet, a pill, to bring their blood pressure down. Once it gets to a target level, we don't then take them off the drug, because the blood pressure goes straight back up again, and that's exactly what's going to happen, what happens with this drug.
But if you're not being prescribed the drug and you're having to buy it yourself, I mean, I have to ask the kind of big one here, is being thin linked to privilege? And how we've heard so many rumors about the access opening and the barriers coming down. Do you have anything that you can kind of confirm with that?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that question. There's a part that Anna alluded to around the privilege of being able to eat healthy foods. So eating healthy is actually quite an expensive hobby. It's also, is hobby the right word? Probably not a hobby. There's also the time privilege of it. If you're a single parent and you've got 2 hungry kids hanging off your arm who want food, you're going to shove something quick in the oven. So there's a time privilege and there's a financial privilege to being thin. And that's for those, that's in the preventative aspect. In terms of the drug, it's expensive. It's about £200 a month. And yes, you're probably going to be on that for life. I think what's going to happen quite soon is that more drugs are going to come onto the market, and actually we're going to see that things like Wegovy is probably going to be dwarfed in its effectiveness by some of the other drugs that are coming down the line, and that's going to have a market impact of making the drugs cheaper, I suspect, in the long term. The patent for these drugs is also going to end in the next few years, which is going to make generic drugs more accessible and more affordable. So we will probably see a price decrease from the private market in these drugs in the next few years.
So, I mean, potentially access is going to sort of blow wide open, but what I also want to do is kind of wind it back a little bit here and get to the root of why we're even talking about all of this and why it's such a big thing in social culture at the moment. And this takes us all the way back to our relationship with food and why it's such a problematic relationship for so many of us. I know, Anna, in your book, How to Talk to Children About Food, you talk about things like food being a moral issue, food language being so loaded, even at home, and the notion of food neutrality, which I kind of struggle with, because can food ever be neutral?
Food itself, when we talk about food neutrality, it's not the food itself that is neutral. It's our language and our perception of food. So the narrative that is, I think, normal, common, societal, everywhere is, oh, you don't want to eat that, it's crap, it's rubbish, it's junk, it's shit, that's really bad for you, that's super healthy, that's a superfood. And so these are all pejorative and value-laden terms. And the problem is, there's literally no specificity in those terms. You have no idea what healthy means. And frankly, if you are hungry and you need fuel, a lettuce is not actually as healthy as a sandwich in that instance. So we can't just use this broad brush. And when children are brought up being told that, one, they don't really understand what it means, but two, it increases anxiety. When foods are banned, because there's so much fear around food, that's what happens when we're not neutral about food, is that there is so much fear. Parents fear it, we fear it, they teach kids to fear it. And then you are in a place where eating becomes a very anxious or loaded thing. But the reality is we need to eat to survive. We talk about the biological mechanisms of the weight set point and the thermostat. We have that because it's a survival mechanism. If we don't eat, we die. If we are too low weight, as we see in anorexia, we die. Anorexia has a mortality rate of 20%. It is the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness. It's really high. When you burn through too much muscle, you end up burning through the heart muscle as well. It's just not safe to just lose weight and be thin. And so when we're not neutral about food, we set up an environment where we become frightened, and that leads to disordered eating and eating disorders. We set up an environment where certain foods are banned or heavily restricted, which in our brain creates a deprivation response, and we think, oh, we're not allowed that, we're deprived of it. And just like with hunger, the biological urge when we're deprived of something and the psychological urge when we feel deprived drives us to seek it and to find it and to eat more of it and potentially binge on it, which is why banning certain foods isn't entirely helpful. And certainly with kids, it leads to those kind of behaviors. We know that food restriction is a linear causal route to binging. Anyone can be made to binge. You could, if we all in here, we starved for 2 to 3 days, and then there was a all-you-can-eat buffet, almost every single one of us would binge on that all-you-can-eat buffet. It's biological. It's our wiring, as Simon said earlier. So restriction's really bad. So we have to have a neutral approach to food where it's balanced. And you can have, this food, more often and this food less often, but we can have it in moderation. And until there are governmental changes around ultra-processed foods and there is more legislation around that, we do live in the food culture that we live in. And so we have to work with it and not pretend that we're not in it.
I mean, I think everything you say can be incredibly scary because we're also seeing that in teens and tweens as well. And for example, we know that in the US, 1 in 3 parents are very interested in giving their children weight loss drugs. And that's an actual stat. And I'm just wondering, Simon, is this going to come to fruition? We have heard that the age is coming down to 12. We know that there are lots of studies going on in various hospitals all around the world. It's quite controlled at the moment. But is Ozempic coming for our kids?
So what we know is that if you are obese as a child, and there are lots of different reasons why people become obese as children, you are much more likely to be obese as an adult and to suffer the consequences of obesity earlier. Going back to how body weight is managed and how it's regulated, even if you're a kid, it's really difficult to lose that weight and to stay off weight, particularly when you're not in charge of your food choices as well. I mean, your parents are largely in charge of your food choices when you're a child. So if there are effective treatments, and again, I'm talking about people who are obese, right? I'm not talking about kids who aren't and whose parents are looking to give it them for other reasons. But if you are obese and we have an effective treatment for it, then the health benefits of that will be tangible and will be long lasting. I don't think we should be scared of treating obesity and thinking. I think one of the things that we have in society is that we see obesity. We don't see obesity as a disease, as a condition. We see it as an aesthetic issue, largely, and we don't see it as being a health. And so we don't see these drugs as being medications, right? We don't see them in the same way that we see blood pressure medications or pain medications. We see it as a way to model our bodies, and that's not what these drugs are designed for. I think there are, like Anna said, we need to tighten up the regulation of how people can get access to these drugs and for what reasons they can get access to these drugs. But if we're looking at them in the arena of where they were developed for treating obesity, for treating the condition of obesity, then they are a real game changer. Whether that's for adults or whether that's for children, then it's a real game changer for those people.
So they do have their place in the right context, no matter what age you are, really. We're almost out of time, but I just want to ask sort of one more question. At Stylus, we work a lot with looking at how brands are engaging in the health and wellness space, and it's been really interesting to see brands from cross categories, from food to beauty to fashion to hospitality, really trying to get involved in this conversation. And everything from high protein meals to fitness classes that help you not have Ozempic butt. The approaches range. Anna, just a quick word, would you tell brands to get involved or steer well clear?
I think if you're going to work with the brand needs to be science-based. It needs to work alongside the medics. It needs to have its foundations properly rooted and not just be in it for the financials or because it's cool. I think it's okay to work with brands if you really understand what you're working with, if you understand the science and you have the correct regulation and medical and scientific input.
So tread very carefully and very sensitively is what I'm getting.
Yeah, but not an outright no.
Yeah. And then Simon, just one more for you, because I want to sort of end off with a future forward look. What do we have to look forward to from the world of weight loss drugs?
So there are lots of developments and lots of drugs coming down the line. What we're seeing with Wegovy is the first of what will be a number of different and more effective drugs. Actually, some of the drugs that are in late stage trials, the amount of weight loss that they demonstrate is almost as effective as bariatric surgery. So we're talking 26% weight loss, which is huge in terms of the clinical benefit that patients with those will get.
And much more than the current ones
and much
offer.
more, yeah. So Wegovy tends to be around 15% weight loss, so some of them are touching 25%. For some people, having it as an injectable drug is a barrier, so some people don't like that. So there are pill forms as well that are being developed, and they're slightly more difficult to develop a pill form of these drugs, but that will certainly increase patient compliance on the drugs. So I think what we're seeing now is really just the beginning of what is a really exciting time, if you're on the Saviour side of the argument, for how we treat obesity in the next 10 years.
All very scary.
All very scary.
So that leads me to the final sort of question for you guys, and it's just a one-word answer, if you can, putting you on the spot. Anna, do you think Ozempic and Friends are society's saviour or saboteur?
Outside of nice guidelines, saboteur.
Saboteur. Simon, ask the same of you. Saviour or saboteur?
Within nice guidelines, for whom they've been developed, absolutely a saviour.
Saviour.
Yeah.
And I'm on the saviour side as well. So let's hear from the audience again. Have we managed to change the ratio? Please, can I have a show of hands? Who's for saviour? That is so many more than when we started. And who's for saboteur? Yeah, still representing, but I think we've definitely gone over to the Saviour side. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.